And this is it, the final Super Cassette Vision game. Released at the very, very end of 1986, Pole Position 2 was the big holiday release for the Super Cassette Vision. And in this case, it really was big. Pole Position 2 is the largest Super Cassette Vision game at 32 kilobytes. Pole Position 2 is a strange way for the system to go out, since this is the only console port of any Pole Position game that was released in Japan at the time. Versions would show up later on a few arcade compilations. So if you were a Japanese fan of Namco's smash hit arcade racing machine, this was it. Pole Position 2 is the most expensive Super Cassette Vision game that you could get. On those extremely rare occasions where a copy is available for sale, you can expect to spend at least 30,000 yen on this one. Obviously, Pole Position 2 is a sequel to Pole Position, but in this case it's a sequel where they just added a few tracks to the game. It plays exactly the same as the original. And while the Super Cassette Vision version was the only Japanese home port, there were other console ports of Pole Position 2. This Atari 7800 port, for example, was a launch title for that system, and while it was released much later, it was intended to come out in 1984, the same year that the Super Cassette Vision launched. And it makes this port of Pole Position 2 look really awful in comparison. Pole Position 2 offers you 4 different tracks when you start the game, and in each of them, you initially start by attempting to qualify for a race. You're given 2 minutes on the clock, and have to complete a lap under a certain time limit in order to move on. If you complete your first lap fast enough, you'll get it right there, but you might need the speed you get from the rolling start on the second lap in order to qualify. In terms of controls, the right button accelerates, the left button brakes. Pressing up will put you in low gear, and pressing down will put you in high gear. And that's literally everything to the game. Pole Position, and by extension Pole Position 2, were among the earliest behind-the-car racing games, and racing is all they have to them. The Super Cassette Vision port of the game is, it's a disaster. I played 6 races of every track, and I never successfully qualified. The Pole Position games have always had a bit of a challenge with digital controls. It is designed for a steering wheel after all. And of all the Pole Position ports I've played, the Super Cassette Vision one is by far the worst. There's a herky-jerky motion to the car, where you can't make smooth lane changes or turns. When a curve is coming up, you'll suddenly find yourself teleported to the side of the road. You have to begin turning long before the curve actually begins. And there seems to be a certain amount of tiered movement, where the behavior of the car suddenly changes at certain speeds. If you go off the side of the road, you can't pull back onto it easily, because you suddenly lose all handling regardless of what speed you're going. You brake from top speed to nothing fast enough to kill a human driver, and that winds up making the brakes useless. You can't even feather them properly because the speed drops so much. The approach I started using was downshifting when I hit the corners because that was the only way I could reliably control my speed. Even then you'll just go flying off the road. The performance of the car is different as you enter a curve than when you're actually in it. That just makes controlling around those corners even more difficult. I suppose it's possible that you could eventually get used to the weird modeling of the car in this game, but the only reason that you'd ever want to is if you had nothing else to play. We're going into 1987 now. There's more options than I can count for racing games out there, and the Super Cassette Vision Pole Position 2 does not stack up. And that brings me to the end of my time with Epoch. This is the last dedicated console that they'll make, though they don't get out of video games. A few years after this, they release a handful of games for the rival platform Famicom, and Epoch finds new success in the early 90s with another electronic toy, the Barcode Battler, and that gets its own video game connections. Epoch is still around as a company, but they're just a toy manufacturer now. The closest they've come to revisiting the Super Cassette Vision were a set of limited edition figurines in 2008 that reproduced their entire line of console games in miniature form. After spending 40 days looking over the work of Japan's third-place console manufacturer, what have we learned? Well, first and foremost, don't try to make your machine be everything. While the original Cassette Vision wasn't a proper failure, it also really wasn't a success. And I'd attribute a lot of that to poor system architecture. Offloading the microcontroller and packing in every possible control scheme created a system where no one really knew what to do with it. The second lesson is you can't do it alone. Epoch kept complete control over development for their systems, and that resulted in a shortage of software, plus a relatively narrow set of games. I think Epoch realized their mistake during the Super Cassette Vision, and worked very hard to correct that course, but it was too little too late. Perhaps the final and most significant lesson here is that you can't be stuck in the past. Even when the developers of Epoch's games were really showing off some skill, they were basically building off games that were 5 years old at that point. As a technology, video games moved a lot faster in the 80s. And always being 5 years behind made Epoch look extremely primitive compared to the competition. Even when the competition was extremely limited, like with the original Cassette Vision, Epoch was offering them a version of something they released in 1977, while Nintendo was making new handheld experiences with the Game & Watch. Epoch is an unsung pioneer of the early days of video games. Despite the limitations of their hardware, they had a lot of firsts for video games. While they weren't really willing to get radical with their designs, Epoch was still willing to experiment in other ways. Often not successfully, but it was important that they tried. The Cassette Vision series was more than just a pair of failed consoles. They were platforms with deep roots and surprising reach. And they deserve to be remembered.